Hi, everyone. My name is Ahmed. I am Palestinian from Gaza, and I'd like to welcome you to this conversation I'm having with my guests, Jumana Bayeh and Maria Giannacopoulos. Today's session is titled Defining Anti-Semitism on Australian Campuses, Reflections on Civil and Academic Freedom. Before I introduce my guests, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we're all dialing in today and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. This land was never ceded, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land, acknowledging that we're dialing in from ground zero of a genocide that occurred more than 230 years ago, and its echoes still reverberate to our day. I'm dialing in from Camaragal country. Many civil society organizations and academic figures have expressed strong sentiments against the endorsement of this new definition of anti-Semitism by Universities Australia a few weeks ago. This rejection continues to manifest in published articles and students' mobilization across campuses. So the wording and the propositions made in the definition are problematic, to say the least. This is akin to the upheaval witnessed just a few years back when the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, was being debated at Australian universities. To discuss this definition, its core thesis and possible consequences and repercussions on academic and civil freedom, I am incredibly delighted today to be in conversation with Jumana and with Maria. Jumana Bayeh is an associate professor in the Faculty of Arts at Macquarie University. Her research focuses on the literature of the Arab diaspora. Maria is an associate professor and director of the Center for Criminology, Law and Justice in the Faculty of Law and Justice at UNSW, Sydney. Her research is on the relationship of law to colonialism. Maria, Jumana, thank you very much for joining me in this conversation.
Well, thank you for having me, or us.
Thank you.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you. Jumana, I want to start with you. So this new definition that was endorsed by almost 39 universities around so-called Australia. So one can't help but wondering, why has there been an urgent need, to define anti-Semitism in Australia over the past few years? I mean, starting from the controversial IHRA, which was, introduced internationally by the International Holocaust Remembrance Organization, which some universities also have adopted in 2022 after a long debate between Australian universities. So why is it urgent to define anti-Semitism currently? I mean, it's almost more urgent than addressing systematic racism and othering of First Nation peoples here in Australia. So why has it been too urgent?
I think that's a good question, because it's a question I ask myself. And starting with the 2021-2022 IHRA, and then moving into this UA one, on both occasions when those conversations, well, at least with IHRA, when the conversations were occurring, and especially now, you'd think that there was some kind of massive rise in Australia of anti-Semitism. That's what the people who are advocates of the adoption of these definitions would want us to believe. I've not seen any data or any research that suggests that there is a rise in anti-Semitism, but what I have seen is a stretching of what anti-Semitism entails. If I come back, just before I go into that, I'll backtrack a little bit. That IHRA definition was pushed by, at the time, I think in 2021, by a newly formed group called the Australian Parliamentary Friends of the IHRA, of which I think Allegra Spender, the Australian Parliamentary Friends of the IHRA, of which I think Allegra Spender, the Australian Parliamentary Friends of the IHRA, of which I think Allegra Spender, the Australian Parliamentary Friends of the IHRA, of which I think Allegra Spender, the Australian Parliamentary Friends of the IHRA, of which I think Allegra Spender, the Australian Parliamentary Friends of the IHRA, of which I think Allegra Spender, the Australian Parliamentary Friends of the IHRA, of which I think Allegra Spender, the Australian Parliamentary Friends of the IHRA, of which I think Allegra Spender, the Australian Parliamentary Friends of the IHRA, of which I think Allegra Spender, the Australian Parliamentary Friends of the IHRA, of which I think Allegra Spender, the Australian Parliamentary Friends of the IHRA, of which I think Allegra Spender, the Australian Parliamentary Friends of the IHRA, was the president of that group or the leader of that group. And there were a few of them. At my university, at least, at Macquarie, which I believe was the first university to adopt the definition, there was no discussion amongst the university community. We went away for the summer, we came back, and our DEI policy had absorbed that definition within the policy. So it was never discussed. And I never found out why it was adopted, except that I know that there was an active, it was sort of in the dying days of the Morrison government, and there was an active sort of campaign amongst parliamentarians that were part of this group to push universities to adopt it. You had other universities that did debate it and came to the conclusion that they would or they would not adopt it. I think in the end, only 5 Australian universities adopted the definition. The IHRA predates October 7, or its push in Australia. And even then, we had these assertions that there was a rise in anti-Semitism, which is why we needed this particular definition adopted at universities. And unlike universities, Australia's definition, this definition was not meant to just be for universities, which is also another interesting sort of point to bear in mind. I think the real reason why there's been an urgent need to define or redefine anti-Semitism and to put it into university policy is not necessarily about a supposed rise in anti-Semitism, but I think more to do with the growth, the global growth, and in particular a growth in Australia, about the intolerability of what Israel has been doing to the Palestinian people for the last 80 or so years, but in particular, as we've seen in the last 18 months. Staff across Australian campuses, not in massive numbers, but in enough numbers, have been setting up groups in support of BDS. You have at Sydney University, Sydney Staff for BDS. We've had successful public campaigns, not in universities, but amongst sort of in the cultural sector. So there was the Sydney Festival boycott. That was quite successful. That was in, if someone can remind me, was it the summer of 2022 or 2023 or 2021? One of those.
So, yeah.
In 2023, we had the controversy of the Adelaide Writers' Week, where the director, Louise Adler, invited a key number of Palestinian writers and had a spotlight on Palestine during that festival. And there were attempts to shut down or to prohibit those people from coming into the country by withholding visas. That didn't work. And there was a huge turnout. I was part of that. There was a huge turnout in the audiences, a lot of support for Palestine there. Come 2023, I think what we can say is that the control by those of the pro-Israeli side of the narrative of this so-called Israel-Palestine conflict, I think it's really become unstuck. And there's this urgency, because the previous tactics, I would say, or attempts to control the narrative and what could be said and what would be believed, I think that that's kind of withered away. And so nothing can be said now. And now we need these definitions from their perspective, I would say, from the perspective of advocates for Israel. We need these definitions to stop any kind of discussion, to stop argument completely itself. So, they're having an argument with, or they don't want any argument, they don't want any debate, they don't want any criticism. Nothing can be said, or what can be said has to be sanitized and said in a particular way. And that's why I think we need the definition. The control of the narrative has escaped from Israel's advocates' hands, and there needs to be something to stop people from actually speaking. You can't put the genie back into the bottle without just completely shutting everyone up. And I think that that's why there's an urgent need to define anti-Semitism.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's actually a tactic, because the Israeli narrative or the diaspora propaganda in the West is incapable of keeping up with justifying what Israel is doing, and therefore they just want to stop the conversation altogether. Maria, what do you think? Why is there an urgent need to define anti-Semitism?
I find I also agree it's an excellent question, because it is asking us to go kind of back in time and to kind of think about these timelines, and there are multiple timelines at play here. And I'm really quite fascinated by what Jumana is saying, because it certainly is about, certainly now, about controlling the narrative. But controlling the narrative is something that, like colonial societies, it's something that has to be reasserted time and time and time again. And so there has to be a kind of reassertion of power. So, you know, my first response is, you know, why has there, you know, to your question, why has there been this urgent need? And, you know, for me, at a very simple level, it's about setting the parameters of a debate by leaving the violent center out of view. Like, that's how a definition, you know, because a definition, okay, is a thing, but it needs a center from which it is made. And so that center then of, you know, of power is the thing that is animating the definition, but through the definition, it is left outside of the frame. So it's about setting the parameters, so controlling the narrative. And then in addition to that, I would say sort of setting the parameters, or the permissible parameters of the debate. Another thought that I had around this question is, again, thinking of the timeline. You know, so I'm thinking of it from, you know, the 2023 timeline. And that was in the settler colony that is Australia. That was the year that we had a constitutional campaign to re-establish, sorry, not to re-establish, to recenter, I would say, colonial law as the legitimate centre of lawmaking in Australia. So, and what was happening there was that there was the impression that this was about racial justice. So the setting up of a yes or no dichotomy through a referendum. It was, you know, this was the idea that we were sort of progressing in a racial justice kind of trajectory. But in fact, what was happening was, again, the setting of the parameters of debate for what would, you know, what would racial justice mean? Oh, it would mean adding something to a colonial law rule book. That's what it would mean. So that, as you can see, does not actually shake the center that is deciding, that is animating, and that is certainly not in a phase, you know, in a period of decolonization. So what I would say is that 2023 timeline, there was, you know, there was an overlap between the October 7 and events in Gaza, and also the so-called vote here in the colony. So, you know, this constitutional campaign was reasserting or reaffirming the centrality of colonial law. And it did this regardless of what the result was or could have been. Like that sort of reassertion of the colonial center was happening. So I think that you know, and as I was saying at the start of this, in response to this question, that the defining of anti-Semitism in this moment is kind of replicating this kind of power dynamic. So you define it, okay, where was the center for this definition being drawn up from? It was from the location of the imperial universities. You know, and to quote Myra and Chatterjee, you know, these are the imperial universities, and these imperial universities do have military arms connected to them as they operate on, not only on the, you know, in this Australian settler colony, but in others as well. So that's kind of my thinking, that, you know, and that it's important to kind of draw those dots. You know, how is, you know, the cleansing of a legal, or the attempted cleansing of one legal regime, how does that connect to genocide, both historical and ongoing, almost at the same time that another genocide is unfolding, or another phase of a genocide is unfolding. So it's, you know, it's the connection of those questions. So it's the reasserting and the setting out of the parameters and trying to remove from view. But as Jumana says, there's only certain things that can now remain out of view, but it's certainly this attempt to keep reasserting who is the center and who must always be seen as outside it.
This is an interesting connection you're making, I mean, between two colonies, you know, that are separated by, I mean, not more than, I don't know, 200 years in time. And we're talking about imperial universities, talking about, you know, weapons manufacturers being heavily invested in our academic structure, and Israel being one of the top 10 weapons exporters internationally. So it does make sense that the first to adopt these kind of definitions that seek to recenter the power, as you mentioned, would be academic institutions. But I mean, Jumana, I can't help also but wondering, over and over again, we hear this definition reformulated around the state of Israel, the legality of the state of Israel. Why does the state of Israel keep popping up in these kind of conversations, you know, talking about Zionism, talking about, you know, the Jewish state? You know, if you question the legality of the state of Israel, you're questioning the remit, or you're questioning the core understanding upon which the state of Israel was built, you know, the right for the Jewish people to have sovereignty, the right for Jewish people to have their own country. Does that make sense, like connecting the state of Israel to a definition of anti-Semitism?
Does it make sense in a logical way? For me, no. And for many people, it doesn't. But I think it serves the supporters of Israel as a Jewish-only state to connect the two. I mean, it has a kind of political leverage, particularly in the Western world, that never wants to be seen as being tarnished with the brush of anti-Semitism. And quite frankly, no sane person wants to be seen as an anti-Semite. But I think that the term, I don't, you know, for want of a better word, is weaponized in a particular way to give justification to a state that exists. Israel is not facing an existential crisis, or maybe I should put it differently. Israel is not in the throes of complete erasure or existential erasure. It's the Palestinians, and it has been the Palestinians for decades that face the real threat. And yet, it is always Israel that is asserting through various means, and I think increasingly over the last couple of decades, or at least decade, this overt tying of anti-Semitism to the legal status of Israel. So to criticize Israel is to be anti-Semitic. I personally, obviously, I don't think that the two should be tied, but I can see why its supporters tied. Now, the first time I actually heard someone try to argue this case was in one of my classrooms, you know, over a decade ago, where a student was arguing this point, that Israel is the state of the Jewish people. To criticize Israel means that you're anti-Semitic. Now, at that time, even my undergraduate students, it didn't fly with them. It didn't work. But I think increasingly it's become, it's gained sort of some kind of credibility amongst certain people, or it's seen as relevant. It's seen as something that you can say and you should believe. I think a real turning point, at least for me and my understanding of the tying of the two and it having some kind of sort of traction, was in 2018 with the introduction of the nation-state law in Israel, like Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people. And what I think that definition did, I don't have a law background at all, but looking at the way it was termed and the way, you know, and its context of how it's sort of unraveled as it's come in, I mean, to me, it's a codification of Israel as a state, it gives legal status to Israel as a state of Jewish nationals, not of its citizens. We used to say, I think we used to say that before the nation state law, but the nation state law to me makes that, gives it kind of a legal status, if you will. And the rationale behind that might have been, I think, to make a stronger case to say that if you deny Israel's right to exist as a Jewish-only state, that we shouldn't have this kind of entity, then, you know, this law can be put forward to say that you're being anti-Semitic, or the charge of anti-Semitism could come at you if you tried to make that argument or make that case. As far as I know, no state in the, you know, in the international community that I'm aware of in the West challenged Israel on this law and said to them, this is not cool, this is not how we operate in the international system. And I don't expect settler colonial states to push them on it. But just to go back to something that Maria said, and it reminded me of, in 2023, when the referendum was happening, I happened to be doing research in America, and I was in Washington, and I walked to the Australian embassy so that I could vote. And it was just before October 7, because I think October 7 happened maybe a week later, or a week and a bit later. And I remember thinking, watching the Australian position response unfold from afar, and thinking there has to be some point at which Albanese acknowledges his own, the irony of his position on The Voice and what he's doing here. And obviously it didn't happen. And the further in time we've gone along, you know, across 2024 and beyond, he's just dug his heels in. The ALP have just dug their heels in. So earlier, like in late 2023, Tony Burke said something about people in his community suffering and feeling great pain, people in his community being Arabs or Palestinians, and feeling great pain about what is happening to the Palestinians in Gaza. I don't think he can say that anymore. I don't think he has said that since then. So again, to question what Israel's doing, or to question it as a state of the Jewish people, gets thrown in and tied up in and packaged as a form of anti-Semitism. And it fascinates me how much people are willing to accept that. And when I say people, I don't just mean me or you. I mean, like, you know, the international state system that we have. Many states just accept that as a given and don't question Israel on it. And when I say many states, I probably should be a bit more specific. I mean, like, the most powerful states in the world, the states that are willing to support Israel no matter what. The other thing I think that's going on here, and this has to be some kind of anti-Semitism in itself, to insist on you being a person having Jewish identity as being tied to a state and tied to a political philosophy, which is Zionism, or political ideology. That there can be no acceptable person who happens to be Jewish, whether they're a practicing Jew or a person of, you know, belong to that culture, that there can be no acceptable Jewish person who happens to be an anti-Zionist, or, you know, groups of people who might be anti-Zionist Jews. That kind of corralling or pushing in or demanding of a community of people to be on the same page politically and ideologically, that to me has to be a kind of anti-Semitism, that you cannot be considered a real Jew if you exist outside of this belief system or this way of thinking. So again, then, you know, then they become the outcast. That group becomes the outcast, and that's another, I think, attempt, or another kind of bonus I get when one gets when you tie those two things together. Yeah.
This is an excellent question. I mean, that nation state law in 2018 immediately reduced the non-Jewish citizens of Israel as a second-class citizens. And also, like you mentioned, tied every single Jewish person in the world to this Jewish state.
Yeah.
But Maria, I wanna get your thoughts on this. Israel is the Jewish representative of every Jewish person in the world. That's what they claim. Israel has been deemed to be an apartheid state by, you know, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, even, you know, NGOs inside Israel, like B'Tselem. So in apartheid South Africa, when people were calling for the dismantlement of apartheid, they weren't faced with this kind of, you know, adopted legal definition like what we are witnessing here. So, you know, why, like, how difficult does this definition make the conversation about the legality of the state of Israel? And like I said, going back to the original question, why does the state of Israel why does it have to continue being tied to this legal definition of anti-Semitism?
Oh, look, I think, I mean, I had some thoughts. Now I've got more thoughts. Like there's so much to say here. Like it's such a rich area for us to keep thinking about. But, you know, just let me start by sort of reflecting on what Jumana was saying about the, you know, the nation state law in 2018. And like, what does it mean? Or rather, what work does it do to have, you know, such a law passed, and then this law sort of working in parallel with, and again in a similar timeline to the push for definitions about what can count as anti-Semitism and whatnot. But, you know, in order to think about this nation state law, you know, we have to think about, well, what is, so if we start with the premise that that Israel is a settler colonial project, then we have to also think about what is the machinery of the law doing in such a political, racial kind of context. And so, you know, what is legal is the strongest form of violence. And so it is an asserting of the facts. It's an asserting of the definitions. It is a seizing and possessing and controlling of territory. So the law is implicated in doing all of that work. And so then we also have, you know, the law operating in this, you know, we have sort of international law operating as well in relation to commenting, as we've seen in the last 2-year period, about the legality of certain actions and certain actors that are, you know, connected to genocidal acts. So we've got sort of these layers of how law is working, like in terms of what is happening at a domestic level. It's not a surprise, like if you think about the way that domestic law interacts, in general terms, the way that domestic law interacts with international law, no state, because of the state system, is going to, you know, will comment on the domestic laws of another country. And certainly when you add that there are, as Jumana's saying, the most powerful players are also, many of them, settler colonial players in the state system, they're not only not going to comment, they're going to probably applaud, support, and, you know, and act, you know, in a way that, you know, gives favor to this, you know, new definition, etc. So what is Israel's legal status? Well, does Israel get to define its own legal status? Like, so now we sort of get into sort of philosophical kind of aporias, like, and it's the question of legal foundation, right? So in the Australian settler colonial context, scholars like Irene Watson is the first one that comes to mind, have written about, you know, the way, you know, that the question of ongoing dispossession and genocide is one that is absolutely and inextricably linked to the question of law's foundation. And she talks about this concept of law full, so full with a F-U-L-L. So is the foundation sort of full of law in its best sense? Well, no, the Australian colonial foundation is one that is state force and violence. And I think we can see this playing out in the Israeli context. So, but what is happening is that the law is being used as a machinery to set, you know, as a colonizing machinery to set out a foundation, like to create a foundation after the fact. Now, this then crosses over into a number of other really, really critical legal questions, like self-determination, like you know, the crime of crimes, genocide, you know, so there are all, so if you're usurping the center and the position from where, you know, concepts are defined for the purpose of having justice done to them, you can see that there is no recourse, there is no justice that can occur if if the legal framework is the very thing that is usurping the space of self-determination, doing so through genocide and through dispossession. So there are all of these different ways that law and laws, international, domestic, are kind of crossing over. And so I would say, like in my own work, and mainly, you know, speaking about the Australian context, the settler colonial context that has, I argue, an illegitimate foundation, and there is no consent at the heart of how, you know, Australian society has been, you know, brought into being. And that when we try through, say, constitutional campaigns to sort of re-cleanse that system, that's an attempt at getting retrospective consent for something that is fundamentally violent. I kind of see that 2018 law sort of trying to do the same sort of thing. So after the fact, you try to, you know, reform the foundation somehow. But I call that nomicide. So how the law is actually a key machinery in state violence, genocide, and in dispossession. So, you know, what is the legal status? I mean, I think it's, yeah, it's an almost impossible question in many ways. But what we can see is that the law is being used to justify, you know, the most extreme forms of violence. And it returns us to, you know, like, you know, Derrida's definition of law being the strongest form, you know, that law is law. What is law? Law is law because it is the strong, you know, because it is capable of being enforced. So there you see the kind of militarized side of it, and that it is imposing itself as the strongest form of social, of organization of that place, through apartheid, through all of the other disciplining mechanisms that have been used.
I mean, even, you know, there's certain international laws that are kind of given more preference than others. Like, we always get this perfunctory statement from our government saying Israel has the right to defend itself, you know, as a state from, you know, terrorist activities, which, you know, organizations the likes of Hamas and Hezbollah are defined as terrorists. So this is part of the law, but the other part of the law that is, you know, more severe, has more severe impact on the Palestinian population, which is the commission of a genocide, has been set aside and given less preference. Jumana, I saw you nodding. Did you want to add anything to what's been said so far?
No, I was just nodding in fierce agreement that Maria gives, you know, legal explanations for what I'm thinking in a more.
It's absolutely, I mean, because I see that this definition of anti-Semitism as a major obstacle into questioning the existence of an apartheid system and a genocidal system indeed. So it's really an obstacle, and it comes around the time when students are mobilizing around campuses, you know, in rejection to the behavior of their academic systems and structures and governments and so on and so forth. So, Jumana, do you think that this definition comes timely to kind of address or combat this kind of students' mobilizations in fear of it making any impacts or, you know, changing the law when it comes to our look at the state of Israel?
Well, I think that the point of the definition is to make it impossible to demonstrate solidarity with Palestine on Australian campuses. I think over the summer, various universities that you know, had encampments in 2024 made sure that in 2025, there would be no way that students could set up those encampments without getting into, without facing serious penalty. And the definition kind of adds a layer of strength in many ways to deter students from trying that again. What I think the main point of the definition, if there can be one main point, is to make it exceptionally hard and harder to express criticism of Israel in the strongest possible terms that we need to be critical of what that state is doing at the moment. So, for instance, if I wanted to have a class, a workshop or whatever, talking about what the phrase, which has been well written about, well unpacked, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. What does it mean? Where does it come from? That's going to be a problem on Australian campuses, because apparently that phrase in itself represents a form of, like, it makes certain students or staff feel insecure, or a great deal of insecurity, because their interpretation of what the phrase is saying is, oh, we want to eradicate, that phrase is saying that whoever says it wants to eradicate Israel, which is actually not the case at all. So I think that the definition is the point is to make it extremely difficult to voice criticism or be analytical in your approach to be critical of Israel.
But does that mean that the encampments around universities were actually making tracts? Like, were they actually working in influencing the academic structures?
Academic structures of what, being critical of Israel, or?
Yes. Yeah.
It's difficult for me to say. I think the encampments were raising a strong sense of awareness and showing bravery amongst our students, and our students have certainly been braver than a lot of our, I don't know how Maria feels, but a lot braver than many of our colleagues. So I think that's where the strength of those encampments were, in terms of showing other academics, your students who are students and quite vulnerable, are doing more than what you've dared to do with all of your sort of status and security around the workplace. Although I understand that security has been eroded. So I think in that regard, the encampments were having an impact, and they were mildly disruptive of everyday university life, but I don't think that they were incredibly disruptive. Like, classes still took place, still happened. Students attended classes. It wasn't like, everything shut down on campuses, but there was a mild disruption, and that was probably irking our universities. But I think really what upset our vice chancellors and our deputy vice chancellors and deans and whatever were the number of complaints that they were getting about the encampments from external bodies that had nothing to do with being on our campuses. And I think that's where the encampments had to shut down, and pressure of whatever pressures were coming with that, whether it was financial pressure or reputational damage as well, in the press. That might have been part of the push to get rid of the encampments, or a big part of the push to get rid of them.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the encampments were kind of opening the discussions on campuses about this and raising awareness about the situation, which has not been talked about by staff, like you mentioned. There's a huge lacking, and that in and of itself was disturbing the Zionist organizations. And I think they were making all these efforts to kind of dismantle this movement. Maria, what do you think? What do you think about the encampment? Were they making actually gains, and that's why they were kind of tried to be reduced or abated by this definition?
I'm very receptive to the idea that, that it is when there is a successful message being presented, and one that is really quite, it's impossible to ignore the truth of that message, and that is what the encampments were presenting. that, that they are powerful. And it is precisely because of the truth in the message that the encampments had that they became these targets. They were also, as you've both said, like they became the sort of visual signifier of the kind of descent towards Israel that was forming. And then the universities were the recipients of complaints from the external bodies, and then it became a battleground in that sense. Another sense, though, in which the encampments were successful was in restoring ideas about what the university is actually for. They were successful in showing that students are not a depoliticized mass of people who are just coming to consume their education, which, many of our that we hear this message all of the time. So they were actually dispelling a whole lot of ideas about how we are supposed to understand the contemporary university and the kind of identity of the contemporary student. And so they were really speaking back and showing very different, presenting something that that students were deeply and are deeply interested in questions of justice, questions of genocide. Students needed no help in my classes at any, I can speak for mine, but I'm sure this was beyond, in joining the dots that many of us have been trying to do now, in this period. Students were incredibly capable of seeing the connections. Students, really powerfully being able to see what was happening very early on. I think that was a very powerful feature. So, to sort of think about how the definition now is, it will sort of feed into kind of future student actions, or how the definition is trying to position the possibility of, future encampments or protests. Another element sort of building on this, what does the law do sort of discussion, like the definition acts as a kind of law in the sense that it's not a law in the same sense, but it is, the law of, will become a practice and regulation of universities. And so, and what it will be doing is effectively criminalizing resistance to state violence. So what is criminalization? Like, so it's, so I'm not, so I guess what I'm trying to do here is just kind of show, what happens when a state takes the position of the definer, and then how it kind of can then cast, create, and generate the category of the criminal and populate it with particular people. So it criminalizes resistance to state violence and resistance. So those who are resisting the state, so how is it working? That those who then are resisting the violence, so those who are resisting the crimes, become themselves the targets of punishment. Again, and in doing that, a layer of protection is created for those who are actually conducting the central violence, and then also a layer of protection for those making definitions to protect those who are engaging in the central violence as well. So, criminalization, as I teach my students, is a technique of colonial power. And it's used by settler states, all of the settler colonial states that we know. And it's linked to carceral power. So it's linked to how colonial societies, criminalize in order to punish. It's there's so many discussions we can have about, the carceral state. But what the criminalization is doing as a technique of colonial power is it's obscuring an uneven power field. That's what it tries to do. So those so again, sorry if I'm being repetitive, those who are resisting the harm are charged with, or could be charged with, doing the harm. So the definition is then working as a containment of protest, or trying to, what's the other word, disincentivize kind of protesting, or generate conditions of fear, so people don't want to speak out because they fear the punishment. So that's how sort of carcerality works. So it's through the kind of fear of punishment, and that, so that is also the work that this definition is doing. It's not an exact form of criminalization, but you can see that the way that the technique is going to be working, if it is put to work, will be to have that kind of impact on how people behave, and which kind of, and who retains, again, the center, not only of defining, because the center for defining is also the center from which punishment can be administered. So the point is that it's not an exact form of criminalization, but the technique and the way in which the definition will function is to deter protest, to generate conditions of fear, and certainly as a technique for containment of protest and punishment for protest. So it's kind of mirroring, so who gets to define is kind of the same power center as who gets to punish or control.
It's such an excellent point. And you know, historically speaking, students' movement have been really, really effective around Vietnam War, around the South African movement against apartheid. So it's one of those kind of seemingly effective strategies to kind of set an example for young generations in particular, not to question any of these colonial laws that are, you know, serving each other across the seas, so to speak. Yeah. So Jumana, I want to talk about your article that you published in the Overland, the University's Australia definition of anti-Semitism, and I do want to read a quote from that definition. For most, but not all Jewish Australians, Zionism is a core part of their Jewish identity. Substituting the word Zionist for Jew does not eliminate the possibility of speech being anti-Semitic. So in your article that you published in the Overland, and I also want to quote you there, the University Australia definition takes us closer to the recognition of Zionism as a protected political ideology and identity. So could you explain a little bit what you meant by that? I mean, does this part of the definition acknowledge, but probably coyly or shyly, that Zionism does not equate to Judaism?
I think it does try to do that, but the effect is the opposite. Let me explain. So, you know, what do I mean by the definition takes us closer to the recognition of Zionism as a protected political identity or political ideology? In my reading of their sentence, or one of their sentences in particular, which you quote, for most but not all Jewish Australians, Zionism is a core part of their Jewish identity. What I think is going on there, and I'm trying to imagine these academics in a room, these high-level academics from our supposed best universities, sitting there and trying to come up with a definition that doesn't corner them, it retains some semblance of academic freedom, and doesn't make them guilty of determining or telling every single Jewish student that they might have, this is what it means to be Jewish. And what I think the solution has been, again, this is just my reading of the language, is a recognition or belief put forward that Jewish identity is a wide or a mobile category. It can be a rejection of Zionism, But for some Jewish people, and apparently for most Australians, based on what evidence, I'm not sure, but maybe it's true, most Australians, Zionism is a core part of their Jewish identity. Now, something in that to me says that if a group of people, a majority of a community want to say that Zionism is a core part of my identity, me as a non-Jewish person, or us as non-Jewish people, are not going to argue with you. You can have that. And in fact, we're going to protect you to have that. That's what I think, that's what I mean by it's taking us closer to the recognition of Zionism as a protected political ideology and identity. And if something is a protected class, and Maria will know more about this because she works in, or her area is more on the legal side, then criticizing it or taking it to task is much, much harder, because that's a kind of discrimination, and we don't want to be guilty of discrimination. That's what I think is going on there with this. And the way that the definers, I think, have made themselves feel okay about this, and I'm supposing, I don't know, is by accepting that for different Jewish people in Australia, being Jewish is a flexible and mobile thing. And within that is included Zionism, and it's okay to have Zionism as part of your Jewish identity, and we're going to protect you to have that. That's what I meant by that particular point about Zionism. Is we've come closer to Zionism being recognised as a political ideology and a protected political ideology and identity. I don't know of any other political ideology that we're not allowed to criticise, or that we shouldn't be allowed to criticise, or what state we're not allowed to criticise. Okay, if I'm pick any political ideology. If I identify with Maoism, does that mean I'm not allowed to be, does that mean it can't be criticised? If the majority of Australians all of a sudden decided that they're something, I don't know, Maoists, or that's a bit of a far reach, but you can see where I'm going with this. Does that mean that we can't criticise them for that? Why is it that there's a taboo now about criticising or to criticise Zionist ideology? And the other thing I want to say about this question, which ties in, goes to the second part of that quote. Substituting the word Zionist for Jew, this is from the definition, does not eliminate the possibility of speech being anti-Semitic. I said in my article, no one is substituting anything. We know the difference between the terms. I know when I use Zionist what I mean, and all of us know what it means. They're the ones that are muddying the waters in that definition, and whoever else wants to confuse the two terms. I think Mark Dreyfus said recently, or maybe not so recently, but within the last 18 months, he said something like, critics of Israel pretend that they're criticizing Zionists. I haven't got the quote right, but this is the point he was making. Pretend that they're sort of criticizing Zionism, but what they really mean is Jew. When they say Zionist, they really mean Jew. That's what he said. No, that's not the case. I don't mean that at all. And all of us don't mean that. We know what we mean when we say Zionist. And to accuse us, to sort of lay that accusation into the definition, as if we are masking or conning them into thinking that we're criticizing a political ideology, or when really we're being critical of or discriminating of Jewish people, is remarkable to me that sentence got into the definition. It's absolutely remarkable. The con job is not us. The con job is what has been going on for the last, I don't know how many, I think it's there's an acceleration in more recent years, maybe over the last decade or two. The biggest con job is this conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. That's the con, not what we're doing. We're asking people to disassemble the two, because the two are not one in the same. But the definition and the proponents of Israel at this present moment, for politically expedient reasons, to have leverage or whatever, are assuming and telling everyone that they should assume that when we say Zionist, we mean Jew. And that's pretty outrageous, and a great way to shut down discussion. A great way to, not to just to shut down discussion, but what you were saying, Maria, which is, disincentivize, because we're going to discipline you if you say anything. And that, to me, is where one of the biggest dangers lies in this definition, and why we need to resist it in every way possible. This is not what universities are about. This is not what critical thinking should be engaged with. If the world, the international community, apparently I'm consistently being told in various ways by my university leaders, is taking a march to the right, that doesn't mean I and our universities need to go along with them. If there's more discrimination happening in the world against all sorts of minority communities, that doesn't mean that I protect one and shut up about the rest of them. It means I challenge. That's what we're supposed to do, I think, as academics and as critical thinkers. And I know critical thinking apparently is a taboo thing these days, but I'm going to hang on to it. So yeah, that's what I thought about that particular question.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, tying a political ideology to a faith and claiming that those critiques of Israel are hiding behind, criticizing Jewish people is counterfactual, because historically speaking, and until this moment, many of anti-Semitic institutions and anti-Semites are actually close allies to the state of Israel. So they advocate for Zionism, but they themselves actually bear a lot of hate and criticism to the Jewish people for being Jewish. And, we know about Christian Zionism, Christian Zionists, which, form a large percentage of the American population. They're all, a bunch of anti-Semites who believe, in the promised land, the state of Israel, in order to, annihilate the Jews. And that's the, if that's not anti-Semitic, then what is?
I think it was Noam Chomsky that talked about that document of the rapture, about that Christ will return and all Jews will be, the land of Israel needs to be populated by Jewish people and they'll all burn in hell and the righteous people will rise to heaven. That sort of doctrine that many Christian Zionists in America apparently believe in. I think Chomsky said that there is nothing more profoundly anti-Semitic than that, and yet these are the strongest advocates of the state of Israel for obvious reasons. Now that I've explained the idea behind it, they're not conflating the two. They know that they're protecting Zionism, but they still hate, as you said, or discriminate against Jewish people. And I'm not conflating the two, because I'm being critical of Zionism as a political ideology, and would, like with all minority groups or people who are being persecuted, would protect them and expect that they would be, they should be protected with every mechanism that we have.
100%. And those encampments around campuses, they were trying to educate the students and the academic system about these facts, that this is not anti-Semitism. This is a legitimate criticism of a genocidal apartheid state that is killing children as we speak. So Maria, I want to go to your
Mind if I make
Please.
one comment about that discussion, because I found it fascinating what Jumana was saying about, that kind of confusion that we see in the kind of writing up of this definition, and that, and Jumana's point about, they don't want to kind of entrap themselves as the definers. And they don't want to be charged with being discriminatory. How ironic is that? But we do have precedents in Australia. So one thing that I thought of was the only thing I can think of all, like back to the days of when I was a law student, that, that religious schools could, were an exception and they could discriminate, like that. There was no other kind of, because, they could decide who was going to be, who was going to be allowed to go into religious schools on the basis of the religion. So that's one thing. No, we don't normally have exceptions when it comes to sort of anti-discrimination. So any lawyers on here would have been sort of really aware of this. But there was a really important precedent, like Ahmed, I don't know if you were around or have read about it. Jumana would remember the Northern Territory intervention. And so what happened there was that for that campaign, that political move really seizing communities and imposing austerity on Aboriginal communities, a form of apartheid, really. For that to happen, what also happened was that they had to they had to remove the operation of the anti-discrimination law for the purpose of this other law being lawful. So it was just this complete game. And again, what work is law doing? Law is a mechanism for power, and it can be used and manipulated in all of these different ways as it is here. So just that point that, again, it's not, exceptions are made, but they're not made outside of the interests of, securing the colony, of securing dispossession, of, removing people from their land, stopping the, the protests around removing people from their land. So there are more dots for us to draw there, like in terms of how this sort of exceptionalism is operating.
And similar strategy was implemented here in this definition. I mean, as you mentioned, Jumana, in your article, I mean, the drafters were working so hard to kind of come up with the right phrase, the right wording to make sure that they include everyone and exclude whatever is not really impactful towards what they're trying to achieve. So it's interesting to read. But Maria, I do want to go to something that you mentioned in your article on at the Overland. So this new definition adopted by or endorsed by Universities Australia stipulates, and I do want to quote a bit of it, quote, a criticism of Israel can be anti-Semitic when it is grounded in harmful tropes, stereotypes, or assumptions, and when it calls for the elimination of the state of Israel or all Jews, or when it holds Jewish individuals or communities responsible for Israel's action. And that goes back to the initial questions that we were talking about. The legality of the state of Israel is tied up to this definition. So in your article at the Overland, you say the new Universities Australia definition of anti-Semitism moves us closer to the possibility that scholarly work calling for the elimination of a settler colonial states could be deemed anti-Semitic. So what did you mean by that, and how does it reflect on the colonial history of this colony here, so-called Australia?
Yeah, I think thanks for asking me that, because there is a lot to say around this. So when I wrote that piece, of course, I had been following all of the analyses on the definition, and my own thinking was, what the hell is going on here? Like, that they're sitting in the middle of a colony and they are drawing up, the boundaries of, what's permissible to say and do around this other settler colony. So I was thinking about this, and that immediately was of concern to me, because the work that I've been doing across my career has been to engage in really anti-colonial or decolonizing approaches to understanding law, to understanding crime, etc. And in doing that work, I am always immersed in scholarly traditions and fields of knowledge, like, the decolonizing literature, anti-colonial literature, critical race studies literature, settler colonial theory, post-colonial theory. So all of these rich bodies of work contain within them, in different ways, they contain other things as well, but they contain often very strong critiques of nation-state formations, especially the ones that are founded in conditions of dispossession, etc. So I'm thinking, how is this work this, scholarly work, core business of academics and universities to be engaging in such work, how is this going to be read? Will I be, so, as a question, can I go into my class as per usual and start by saying that, I mean, they probably wouldn't mind if I said Australia is an illegitimate exercise, but, where is the line, right? What are we now allowed to say? And I do focus, like there are many scholars or key writers that I could point to, but one of the reasons that I drew a little bit on Patrick Wolf's work for the Overland piece is because he really does, the language in Wolf's work is very much about how settler colonialism is eliminatory in its logic, and it seeks to what's the expression, to remove, to replace, and that there is a permanency to the settler colonial exercise. So it's not like other forms of colonialism where the colonial power packs up and goes away after a certain timeline. It is a permanent state, and land is the reason for it, like the control of land and territory. And so, and the reason I wanted to kind of focus on Patrick Wolf, and he's extremely well quoted and followed in this area, and his use of the concept of elimination, because we can also see that this concept of elimination has been weaponized within the definition, so the UA definition. So what is happening is that there is a taking up of the language that comes from the critiques, and then trying again to kind of muddy the waters and suggest that if I call for, using Patrick Wolf's work, an elimination of this, calling for an elimination of the state of Israel, that it is I who is, calling for elimination, when their version of elimination has already occurred because of a pre-existing elimination. Like, so it's completely, again, like a mind, it's completely confusing and aphoretic. Like we don't, it's hard to sort of trace. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is, what happens to these bodies of work as areas of legitimate inquiry, like in relation to decolonial approaches to many sort of fields of knowledge. A lot has been said about everything's been decolonized and decolonizing has been done to death. And again, I think this is operating in a very kind of insidious way, because in fact, as we know, the processes of decolonization are nowhere near having begun. So whilst disciplines can claim to be decolonizing themselves, this the actual work of decolonizing, which means undoing systems and the way that power is organized in settler colonies, has not yet commenced. So, my concern is that these are legitimate areas of knowledge and important locations for our students to be directed to, if they are interested in social justice, which we know many of them are. But what does a definition like this do to such scholarship? So that sort of is my kind of question and concern to to the the drafters of the definition, and now the universities, and how these are going to play out in the everyday in our classrooms.
Absolutely. And the question of decolonizing, I think it's a vast area that really needs to be discussed. Like, what are the dynamics of this concept of decolonization? How do we start, decolonizing the language, decolonizing the thinking, how we, perceive things around us? It probably requires another session to talk about that. But in the last couple of minutes, I really want to get your thoughts, Jumana and Maria, about how to move forward with this definition. What are our obligations, and as an academic, as regular people, like as also First Nation communities, like how do we respond to this kind of thing that is imposed on us?
The short answer is do what we're doing, which is to talk about it, resist it, unpack it, be critical of it in the ways that it needs to be examined and scrutinized, and do the kind of, to approach it with suspicion and read it, with a suspicious eye, for want of a better word. But another thing I'll say is this. I met with one of the many managers I have at university to discuss my concerns with this definition being imposed and what it might mean for my scholarship and my teaching. And the response from that person was, let the definition empower you to speak the truth. And so I heard that and I went and wrote the article. And that's where I'm going with this. And that's the only thing I can say.
Defy it, just keep on defying it and not letting it consume us, I guess. That's
certainly one approach I'm definitely taking. And, doing things like this, if I have another reason to write about it, I will. I feel like I've exhausted most of what I can say about it, but I'm sure that something might come up and I'll write about it again. Maybe I'll have an experience of the definition being applied against me. So things like that are the ways I think we should move into the world of having this definition adopted by some of our universities. I don't know where they are with that.
Absolutely. Maria, in the last couple of minutes, what can we do?
I'm complete agreement with all of Jumana's points. I think that there are, I have to be honest with you, there are, as someone who has, in the last 3 years been impacted by a restructure at another university, having now come to my current university, it would be a lie if I said that I never thought about what would be the possible repercussions of doing work that is quite publicly facing, like writing general opinion pieces, etc. Open and also, running events and the like. And, I have thought about it. I have been concerned about it. But I also, in these moments, kind of draw on, what I think is my very deep understanding of what academic work actually is, and the way in which I understand, being an educator and a researcher at a university is, for me, fundamentally about serving, social justice. And, and when I when I think about the work that I ordinarily do, and then the work that I am moved to do based on various events and things that are unfolding, then I kind of keep focused on that I'm not actually doing anything that is outside of what is ordinary academic work, inquiry, asking questions, having respectful dialogue, engaging students, being respectful of students of all backgrounds, being particularly sensitive to students with backgrounds who have suffered extraordinary loss. And so I see that as my core business. And, we are employees, there are constraints around us, but we still have, there is this definition. We are all worried about it. But I think that for me, it has been important to decide that in the shadow of this definition, I'm not going to start self-censoring. because I think that is, that's a slippery slope. So, you know, holding on to what we know is our work, is our core business, and continuing to do that, you know, to serve justice and to serve our students.
Absolutely. And you know what, Maria and Joanna, I mean, the imposition, to my understanding, the imposition of this definition on academic institutions, I think it creates some sort of excesses and contradictions. And one of the contradictions that it will potentially create is these conversations that we're having right now, talking about why it is harmful, why is it terrible, and emphasizing the wrongdoing of the state of Israel, the genocide that is being committed now, and this definition is starting, you know, trying to justify it. I mean, all this that we're doing now, I think that the imposition of definition is actually shining the light on the state of Israel even more. So I think it's from that perspective, we look at it from that lens, I think it's a good thing. So that's one thing moving forward, to keep criticizing, keep questioning, keep talking about why it is harmful and why it's not. I know, like, you know, Dr. Stephen Salaita, you shared his article the other day, Jumana, says that it's frustrating, to say the least, that we are having to talk about the definition rather than focusing on a live stream genocide, you know, the killing of children, the dismembering of men, women, and children in Gaza as we speak, and we busy ourselves talking about seemingly marginal definitions. But it's, I would say it's equally important, because it's part of emphasizing or spotlighting the crimes that Israel is committing. Any last words, any last comments do you guys want to add?
Just to that, you know, we are, the fact that we are talking about the definition has us distracted from the main power field, but we are ourselves in a power field, in the ideological arm of the genocide. So we are not outside it. And therefore, everything we do in relation to not being silenced on that is relevant and extremely important.
Couldn't agree more. And to everyone who is listening, keep talking about it and keep discussing it, keep criticizing it, and keep shining the light on the live stream genocide that's happening. On that note, I really want to thank you, Jumana and Maria, for your time and really insightful conversation.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.